Good evening, everybody. It is really nice to be back in our study this evening. We are back in chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. Last week, we went through a pretty healthy dose of it. We went through about the first 10 verses or so. And we had said that this was very much a picture of history pre-written. God has this incredible ability to exist outside of time, to be beyond time, and to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future of time. We, on the other hand, are not so good at that. Getting ready to talk to you all again tonight, I was reading about some of the things that mankind has predicted over the years, and I thought I'd share with you some of them to prove to you just how incapable we are in terms of predicting the future. In 1773, King George II said that the American colonies, 1773, had no stomach for revolution. The White Star Line had an official that infamously said before the ship's maiden and only voyage that Titanic was unsinkable. And one of my favorites, in 1939, the New York Times had released an article speaking about the future of television. They said the problem with TV was that it would necessitate that you glue yourself to a screen. And in the future, it wouldn't be very popular because Americans don't have time for that.
I believe they've been wrong before.
Pretty sure. We're not that good at predicting the future, apparently, but God, on the other hand, is so beyond exact. People look at this text and they think that it has been written after the fact. Daniel sees a vision of several, I would say 6 world kingdoms. Last time we talked about how he saw these great beasts, a lion with wings, a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth raised up on one side, a leopard with 4 heads in this great and dreadful beast, or the great and terrible beast. And we said that represented the kingdoms of Babylon, Medo-Persia, or just Persia, the Greeks, and the Romans. Daniel sees those 4, but he also sees the coming kingdom of the Antichrist, and he sees the coming kingdom of Jesus Christ. I'd like to direct you back now into Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. I want us to take another look at these 10 horns, and specifically the little horn that was attached to that great and terrible beast. Tonight we want to talk some more about history pre-written. Notice, if you would, Daniel 7 and verse 8, he says, I considered the horns, that is the horns on the great and dreadful beast, the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. The other kingdoms represented in this chapter, besides the 4 we've seen last time, and the coming kingdom of Christ, is this, the coming kingdom of Satan and the Antichrist. Verse 12 indicates that this kingdom is going to come, some of those other kingdoms are going to exist in some way even after the other kingdom devoured it. But this is the same vision God gave to Nebuchadnezzar, but Daniel sees a bit more. Nebuchadnezzar saw the 4 earthly kingdoms too, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But Daniel sees a far worse kingdom, a kingdom that will declare war on God himself, the kingdom of Antichrist. If I could juxtapose this by rereading to you Nebuchadnezzar's vision, in Daniel chapter 2 now, in verse 34, Daniel tells the king, he saw a stone that was cut by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and gold altogether were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that there was not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And he goes on to talk about what I believe to be the kingdom of Christ. In Daniel 2 and verse 44, he tells the king, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it had broken pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. We talked about it when we were in chapter 2. Some people interpret that as the church. Our amillennial friends interpret that as the church. I do not. They say that because the stone comes during the days of the great and dreadful beast, they say, being the legs of iron, but they're misinterpreting it in a few ways because it's not the legs of iron from which that kingdom arises. It comes during the mixed kingdom of the feet mixed with iron and clay. That would be the kingdom of the Antichrist. Again, why I say this is the millennial reign of Jesus. This is the second coming, the literal parousia. And this is more or less what we see in Daniel chapter 7. I'm going to go back up a bit, reread you the story of the great and terrifying, dreadful beast. Notice in verse 7, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns, which correlate quite well with the 10 toes of the statue of iron and clay. I want you to notice verse 8 again. In this horn were like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. We need to talk about, before we get into the little horns, what those 10 horns are. There's been a lot of debate over that, and I don't suppose it's anything that one should be unnecessarily dogmatic about. My favorite thing about eschatology and prophecy is that I hold it to be what I call inside baseball. It's a conversation for the saved that should not necessarily cause hurt feelings and divisions, because we know who wins in the end, and it's the great God of heaven. And as much as I love to talk about things concerning eschatology, I don't think one particular interpretation of prophecy will send you to hell any more than another one would, because I suppose these are things for saved souls to consider and not necessarily a part of what would save you from sin in the first place. Although I think there's a great comfort and peace in knowing prophecy. A lot of people argue about it. Yes, ma'am. Whoever's right or wrong, God's going to make something happen. But I want to talk about who these 10 horns might be. We also say they correlate to the 10 toes. Some of our friends say the 10 horns are the Roman Empire. I don't think so. The dreadful and terrifying beast is the Roman Empire. The horns are coming out of the Roman Empire. Now, some people have used that also to say that the 10 horns represent 10 kingdoms that would come out in the medieval era. Some people say these 10 horns correspond to the medieval Catholic Church. And the little horn that spoke great things would be the Pope. I don't think so. Now, I'm not going to suppose or say that the Catholic Church has nothing to do with the eschatological future of God's prophetic plans. A big part of me is convinced they do. That the Catholic Church does have a role to play yet future. And I'm sure we all have opinions on that. Especially if you go read Revelation 17:18. The woman seated on the beast, the woman sitting on the 7 hills, the woman that was drunk with the blood of the saints, the great whore, the great harlot of Revelation. Some people think that's the Catholic Church. These 10 kingdoms, though, I don't suppose they are necessarily Rome. I don't think it's the Catholic Church. I will tell you, Daniel was speaking in a language his hearers could understand. When he said horns, he was speaking in a language common to his day, in the language his hearers would understand. He was speaking of 10 kingdoms, and here in our interpretation might see that better as a word like nations. 10 nations that would come out of the great and terrifying beast. Some students of Bible prophecy look at the European Union as a precursor to the 10 horns or the 10 nations. I don't know, and that's difficult to really swallow because there's more than 10 kingdoms or 10 nations in the EU. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it. One that I've really started to gravitate toward, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but one that I thought was very incisive was something that was set forward by a prophecy guy, an eschatology guy named Amir Safadi. Y'all have heard me talk about Amir Safadi a lot. If you've never listened to him, he's a Messianic Jew. He is phenomenally, as I said, incisive when it comes to his prophecy lectures. Very good, very to the point. Unique perspective because he was a major, or is a major in the Israeli military. Very unique perspective. But he argued that the 10 kingdoms, or the 10 horns, are parts of Europe. And if you look at the way the book of Revelation sets up the first beast of chapter 13 and where he is going to come from, there's an argument to be made here. The little horn, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I will tell you the little horn, as I said a moment ago, is Antichrist. And so these 10 horns have to be the place from which Antichrist is going to come. A lot of people believe he'll be a Jew, some say Gentile, but even more people are on the same sheet of music in supposing that he is going to come out of Europe, whether he's a European Jew or a Gentile. And a lot of the reason for that, in Revelation 13, the beast that's coming out of the sea, the Antichrist, coming out of the sea, John is told in another passage of Revelation that the sea is talking about nations, multitudes, languages, and parts of the world. A sea of people. And from what I've read, the sea can often be indicative of the Gentile world, whereas the land, the second beast in Revelation 13, would be perhaps Israel. The idea being that Antichrist may arise out of the Gentile world. If you look at where Europe is today, it's hard to deny how post-Christian they are how secularized they have become, and dare I say, how ready for the Antichrist they really, really are. And I don't just say that as a conspiracy theorist, I say it as a matter of fact. When you survey the situation in Europe, it's astonishing. There was a woman in the United Kingdom last winter, if you remember, she got arrested for silently praying outside of an abortion clinic. You look at the way the European Union and the United Nations goes about doing their things, both politically and propaganda-wise. There's a lot that just screams readiness for Antichrist to me. Now, Amir Safadi had set forward this argument.
They're moving toward that one-world government.
They are moving towards a one-world government from which this satanic furor is going to arise.
They already have their one-world government.
They're working toward it.
The European Union controls all of Europe.
And I'm telling you, when you look at where the European Union is and where they come from, it is a compelling point. So if we're on the same page here, perhaps thinking where the world is going to produce Antichrist, if it's Europe, if that is the 10 kingdoms, the 10 nations, this is what Amir Safadi had set forward. Now, if you read this text, it says that there was a great and dreadful beast. It had 10 horns. The little horn is going to come from where 3 of the other horns are rooted up. Amir Safadi had set forward this argument. The Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Burgundians, Lombards, and Suevi are the 7 of the other 10 horns that remain. And today, those parts of the world are Spain, England, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Portugal. The other 3, that being the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Heruli, I don't know if I'm saying that right, they were perhaps the ones that are rooted up because they don't exist anymore. I can't swear by that. I, again, am not going to be unnecessarily dogmatic about it. Here's the idea in summary. Here's the main point. Whether it's these kingdoms or anywhere else, there's going to be some sort of confederation of 10 nations, which in some way is an extension of or emerges out of the remnant of the Roman Empire, that being the great and dreadful beast. Out of this confederation, Antichrist will emerge and organize the world to fall under his grip and work immediately towards opposing God. Now here's what we've seen so far. Daniel sees this disturbing dream before the Persians even conquer the Babylonians. He sees these beasts coming out of a stormy, wind-tossed sea. Again, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the great and terrible beast, the great and terrifying beast. And we see that representing world kingdoms. The Babylonians who were conquered by Cyrus the Great and the Persians who were conquered by Alexander the Great and the Greeks who were supplanted by the Romans, and the Romans who more or less are going to exist longer than the other kingdoms, but ones who are going to leave in their wake some sort of remnant from which Antichrist is going to come in some way or another. Phone being silly. And we need to talk about the little horn. Coming from that terrible beast, Daniel sees 10 horns and then one small one. Now let's consider the little horn. I tell you, this is the Antichrist. There's little doubt of it. I said it before, I'll say it again. The things Daniel saw are the same things John saw. And it's the same things the apostles wrote about, Peter and Paul. For example, Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction." That is this guy, the first beast of Revelation 13. Brother Don likes to say it's impossible to have a full-fledged understanding of the book of Revelation without understanding the book of Daniel. And I'm not going to say that the opposite isn't also true. I think it is. I think a better understanding of Daniel would be had by having an equally better understanding of Revelation. These two books go in tandem because John and Daniel saw the same thing. Didn't write it in the same words, but they were given the vision by the same God.
Some of what was revealed to Daniel, God told him to close it up because it wasn't time to reveal it until John's time, and he revealed it in Revelation.
So among those things that Daniel saw and John saw, one was told to seal, the other told to unleash. Let me share with you why I say it is unequivocal that this is Antichrist. So notice, if you would, in Daniel 7, verse 24. Speaking of this little horn, this is later on when the angel is explaining it to Daniel. The angel says, "The 10 horns out of this kingdom, 10 kings shall arise, and another," listen to this, "shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones. He shall put down 3 kings." That's the 3 little horns he supplants. Listen to this verse. "He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time." Okay, with that fresh in your mind, allow me and permit me, if you would, to read you what John saw when he saw the first beast of Revelation 13. I jot down Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 to 10 in my Bible, if I were you. Listen to what John says. I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its head. Now what he says next isn't necessarily the same as Daniel, but he mentions the same animals. He says, the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, its mouth was like a lion's. I don't think that's an accident. I don't know if it's not God's way of saying Antichrist is going to be even more powerful than all the ones that came before him, because he will. John says, one of its heads seemed to have a normal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who can fight against it? Now, listen to this sentence. This is Revelation 13:5. John says, the beast was given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling. That is, those who dwell in heaven. Compare that to Daniel 7 in verse 8. The latter half of verse 8, Daniel says, behold, in this horn were the eyes like that of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Your translation might say boastful things or arrogant things. How about this verse, Revelation 13:6, verse 7. Also the beast was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. Compare that to Daniel 7 in verse 22. Or rather, not 22. Verse 25. He shall speak words against the Most High and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. This is the same figure. It's Antichrist. This little horn is mentioned having the eyes of a man also illustrates something to us. One, it suggests that Antichrist has remarkable knowledge and skill in planning his exploits. He's going to be capable of using words to motivate people to follow him. People do not understand how mesmerizing, hypnotic, and spellbinding wicked leaders and dictators can be. Those who listen to the speeches of Adolf Hitler attest to the man's oratory. When I was in college, I took a class on public speaking. And in one of our studies, we actually sat down and examined Hitler's speeches because he was really good at speaking. Now, he spoke in German and used his hands a lot.
Satanic control.
I think he was satanically influenced, but to say that the man was not a good speaker is a mistake. When he became Chancellor of Germany, I want to say it was when he became Chancellor. When he addressed the Reichstag and the Reichsrat the first time as Chancellor, I want to say it was then. They had the microphone set up and ready for him, and they had it on video. He walked up to it, and he stood there, awkwardly, for like several minutes, waiting for the room to more or less continue to edge closer and closer to the very edge of their seats, dying to hear what he was going to say. And those who lived through the Third Reich, as I said, have attested to how hypnotic he was as a speaker. He was a very influential speaker. But he ain't going to be nothing compared to the real Antichrist. A lot of us Christians, we think of the Antichrist as being, yes, Satan's man on earth, but a lot of times we don't also realize how much the world is going to loud after and follow after him. I believe he may or may not be the one whom Jesus was talking about when he says to the religious leaders of Jerusalem, you don't, accept me, but another who comes in his name you will accept.
But look at the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Who's sworn to the prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
I mean,
How many people go to hear Joel Osteen and so many others?
These people are God's
Yeah.
chosen, anointed, God's anointed ones.
And that's not an unbiblical premise. You look at one of my favorite sermons of the entire New Testament is Paul's sermon in the Areopagus of Athens, Mars Hill in Acts 17. Paul delivers this awesome sermon. I mean, he reaches them where they are. He really uses a great illustration. He says, I see you've got this altar to the unknown God. Let me tell you about the God you don't know. And I mean, he smokes it. I mean, home run of a sermon. But if you read it, the response he got was pretty pitiful. It wasn't like a Day of Pentecost response, for whatever reason. And for that same reason, you get in his writings in the epistles how much at enmity the world is with the things of God. And when you have a man who is so imbued and endowed with the power of Satan, it's no wonder the world is going to follow after him like white on rice. And it says he has the eyes of a man. I think he's going to be able to perceive and really seem to give people what they want, say what they want to hear, and show them what they want to see.
Satan is the father of lies.
the father of lies. Jesus also called him the ruler of this world. Now, there's something else about that eyes of man. One person pointed out as I was studying for this that I thought was interesting. In the Old Testament, prophets are called seers. A lot of times they're given that title because they can see as God can. They're given the eyes of God. I think about the things that God revealed to someone, say, like Elisha, when the Assyrians were coming to attack, and he prayed that his compatriots would be able to see as he sees, to see as God sees, and he sees all these angels. God has eyes different from men. But it says this guy has the eyes of a man, which indicates to me Satan, as much as he would say otherwise, is not omniscient. He does not see all that the way God sees. He's not omnipotent, as God is. But Antichrist is going to still blaspheme God and convince the unbelieving world that he is God. When I say the entirety of Scripture is overwhelmingly consistent and cohesive in speaking about this figure, it's any wonder then people could walk away with any other interpretation. I showed you John saying the same thing in Revelation 13, Daniel saying this in Daniel 7. Listen to what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 2. He says, the day will not come unless rebellion comes first, till the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. But listen to what he says. Who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. They're all singing different verses of the same song. This man will become the ruler of the world and control the economy and the religion. And if you study the book of Daniel with a healthy understanding of Bible prophecy and Revelation, you're going to see a lot about Antichrist. He's going to make war on God and on the saints. And according to both this and Revelation, it says here he will wear them out. Revelation says he was allowed to make war on them and to conquer them. There's not a happy ending until the second coming. Some of those kind of dramatic prophecy movies like the Left Behind series and stuff, every now and again, some of them have a happy ending where the Christians somehow outsmart the Antichrist. That's not going to happen. They're going to die. They're going to be vindicated when Christ comes back. This is why when you read the book of Revelation, my mind is blank on the chapter, but when we see the prayers of the holy ones and the prayers of the saints getting up to God, and one of their prayers is, how long, O Lord, will you wait? How long are you going to allow this kind of thing to endure? God's not going to sit idly forever. He is allowing his plan to come to fruition, and at the end of said reign of Antichrist, Jesus will come and take care of all of that stuff. They will be vindicated, but in that span of time, that brief sphere of influence Antichrist is going to be given, it's going to be unlike any other time the world has ever seen. Jesus said in Matthew 24, were it not for the sake of God cutting it short, no one would survive. And one other thing I believe it was Amir Safadi said, it was either Amir Safadi or John MacArthur. Two totally different people, but I don't know why I'm putting them together. I can't remember who said it. They had pointed out how much of human history is going to culminate in 7 years. It was Donnie. Donnie McGee's the one that said it. Donnie was talking about in Revelation. At the very beginning of Revelation, John sees a great many things in this book. And with what Donnie called the preamble, the first 3 verses, John says he saw something that was going to take place quickly. In verse 1 it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants the things that must soon take place. Don made the point in saying that word soon there isn't necessarily only in reference to something that's going to happen shortly. It also refers to something that's going to happen quickly. And in the grand scheme of eternity, 7 years is not all that obscenely long. What we're going to find then, as he had argued, is that all the thousands of years of world history of humanity doing what it does, whether in rebellion to God or in redemption because of Christ, coming to complete crescendo and culmination in those 7 years. And it is this little horn that is going to be at the center of it, this Antichrist. Notice in verse 21 again, it says he will, as I said a moment ago, make war on the saints, prevail over them. But this is what I mean when I say God is not going to allow it forever. Verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. God is not idle, nor is he going to sit and do nothing on behalf of his people, whether they're tribulation saints or saints of the church age. Daniel is speaking of believers in Christ there, as he and John both tell us that the Antichrist will overcome them. But I stand here to tell you this much. Both the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, as frightening as they can be in some of their passages, they are not meant to scare you. They're meant to comfort you.
God calls it a blessing, to read and study.
They do. He does. And that is because these passages are not meant to make you sad. It's meant to make you glad, because it tells you who is going to triumph in the end. And no study of Daniel 7 would find itself in anywhere near completion until we look at verse 9 and we see this final world kingdom. The world kingdom that is that stone that came and destroyed Nebuchadnezzar's statue and set itself up as a mountain that covered the whole face of the earth. Which, again, I do not hold to be the church. God bless our friends that interpret it that way. That is their prerogative. I just cannot subscribe to it. Number one, the church never destroyed any of those earthly kingdoms. Number two, the church did not come about during the days of the kingdom mixed with iron and clay. It began during the days of Rome, but not during the days of Antichrist. And finally, the church did not come to a point where it not only destroyed all other earthly kingdoms, it set itself up so it can rule the world unchallenged. That's not the church's job. That's Jesus' job. And we say we want to be ready for when Jesus returns to get his bride. But the thing is, if we are ready when Jesus comes to earth to ransom, reconcile, and save the church, rescue the church, those are going to be the same ones that come back with Jesus in Revelation 19. This is why Daniel says that the saints are going to possess the kingdom of the Most High, those that come with Christ in Revelation 19. I want you to notice in verse 9. It's going to be the church. That's right.
Prior to that, the church is gone.
That's right. Daniel 7, verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. That's God. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels burning with fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. And I looked then, because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. Folks, like the book of Revelation, I told you, this is not meant to scare you, it's meant to strengthen you. We see the sovereignty of God still in the book of Daniel. That even though all these things are happening, all these beasts, all this wickedness, God is still in control.
Amen.
He's still holding a pretty serious grip on the reins of eternity.
Isn't it amazing, though? Us as Christians, we know God prevails. We know we belong to Him. But Satan still believes that he is going to be God. He still believes it.
Well, Mom, he still wants as many people as he can gather to destroy along with him
Bingo.
throughout the ages.
And that's a separate sermon. But I want to show you two things before we end tonight. I want you to look at the heavenly throne of the Father. This is the throne room of God. This parallels the Ancient of Days in Revelation 4 and 5. In Revelation 4 and 5, we saw there, you remember the lamb that stood as though slain, had 7 horns, and he was the only one that could open the seal or break the seal of the scroll. It's the same scene that John saw, that Daniel saw. Daniel says he sees these fiery flames. If you've ever read the book of Ezekiel, and you've looked at the way Ezekiel describes angels, it's not little cherubs with, soft little buttery butts with, heart-shaped arrows and bows. The angel of Ezekiel would give most children nightmares. And one of the most freaky ones is something that looks like a gyroscope, just this ball of wheels with eyes all over it that is on fire.
Is that the one came in and got Elijah?
I'm not sure.
Didn't it come with wheels?
Elijah was caught up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Chariot of fire. I don't suppose it had anything to do with the wheel. But neither way, this is something similar to what Daniel sees. But then not only see the heavenly throne of the Father, we see the earthly throne of the Son. Notice in verse 13, Son of Man being a familiar title for the Lord Jesus. Jesus used that of himself often, and that title appears in the gospel over 80 times, Son of Man. The Son of Man is presented here before the throne of the Father and given dominion over all nations. Y'all, I've been listening, as I said Sunday night, we were talking about Unitarianism, oneness theology, the idea that there's not such a thing as a Trinity. And they say it's a New Testament distortion and delusion of the Old Testament Scriptures. I cannot read Psalm 2 and not see Jesus all up and down it. In fact, I think there's 3 pieces of Psalm 2 that directly correlate to the 3 pieces of the Trinity. But when we're thinking about the Son, listen to what Psalm 2 says. Ask of me and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. We're told 6 times in the book of Revelation that Jesus' kingdom is going to come and it's going to last 1,000 years.
Amen.
This is what we see at the end of this vision. God is going to allow all of these things to play out. He knows what's going to happen. We can have conversations concerning His sovereignty about that which He wills to happen and that which He allows to happen. Y'all would have been probably in hog heaven talking about the sovereignty of God in my U.S. history class yesterday. If y'all think back to high school and maybe think of a term that only history teachers probably remember, there was a term that was coined in the 1840s by a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan. They were talking about expanding west in those days. That is, the United States taking not only that which was the Louisiana Purchase territory, but beyond that, the Midwest, the Southwest. The term is manifest destiny. It was the belief that the United States was ordained by God Himself to expand. And there's an interesting argument to be had there. Because on one hand, that's kind of shifty to put in God's mouth. Because I don't read anything in this book about the United States. Not really. And to say that this is God's will that I do that. You can say that about all kinds of things. Why were you speeding, sir? Well, God told me to. You can say that about a lot of things. Doesn't make it so. However, I brought this little brain buster up to my students, especially those who are Christians. I said, listen, whether or not it was God's will that the United States expand west, we did. So who's to say if He willed it or He allowed it? That's a God question.
God permitted it.
Either way, what we talk about His perfect will, His permissive will, His descriptive will, His decreed will, there's a lot of arguments to be had there. And when it comes to the history of the world, we can have that same conversation. What God allows, what God wills. Either way, in the very end of it all, He is by no means anywhere far removed from the center of control of everything. We see this Antichrist come, but praise God, the book of Revelation doesn't end in chapter 13, 14, or 15, or even 17 or 18. We get to chapter 19 of Revelation, and we see the literal second coming, where Christ comes back to this earth, and where He will reign 1,000 years.
Sets up His kingdom.
It's the same thing we see right here in Daniel chapter 7. We're not completely finished here. As you notice, there's still a good yet of Daniel's explanation to be had from the angel. If y'all would like, we can examine the rest of this chapter when we return. There's more or less the remaining portions of the chapter where Daniel is told by the angel that is visited to him, or that visited him, what it means. But if it's all the same with y'all, I would like to read you chapter 7 and verse 28. And when we come back next week, go ahead and move into chapter 8. Y'all have my outline, you have my exegesis, you have some questions. I suppose you can study the rest of chapter 7 on your own time. I would like to end, though, with chapter 7 and verse 28, the very last verse in the chapter. After Daniel sees all these tremendous things, has this very serious experience, he says, "Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed. But I kept the matter in my heart." As we're going to see in chapter 9, Daniel is given a great many visions concerning his people Israel and what God has in store for them. And I'm sure it alarmed Daniel greatly. I don't suppose I could have a dream like this and not think about it for a little while afterwards. But he said something so profoundly applicable to you and me, I suppose we could probably make some money if we put it on a bumper sticker. Here's the end of the matter for me. God's got it taken care of. You want to know why I was able to tell a woman more than thrice my age I was so very calm about Russia invading Ukraine 2 years ago? I told you all this story before. She slid into my classroom like Kramer on an episode of Seinfeld. Not kidding. She did this whole number, and she came up to me, "Please, would you give me some consolation? Give me some peace. I'm so worried. The world's going to end. Russia's invading Ukraine." I said, "It's going to be all right." "How are you not alarmed?" And I said, "Because it doesn't matter what president does this to that president in whatever country. There's a king on his way." And I pray that no matter how the news goes, whatever you know about eschatology, however you feel about the book of Daniel, no matter